Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. In this podcast, I will be connecting two different perspectives which have not usually been connected. So I may be doing it for the very first time. We'll see what happens. Those two perspectives are Maoism-Third Worldism and intersectional Marxism. Of course, Maoism, Third Worldism, we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. Uh, Intersectional Marxism, I've hinted at, I mentioned very briefly, but have not gotten into in that much detail. So, what I will try to do in this podcast is to show that those two perspectives are not only compatible, but are important to each other. In other words, each one can help the other. Each one can help the individual scholar, the individual activist, the individual theorist to become a better communist. And I think that is the goal for all of us, or should be, to engage in better conscientization so that we can take part in critical conscience and consciousness raising in a more effective way. That will be my goal in producing this podcast. And I promise I will do the best I can. Can't make any guarantees, but I will do the best I can. So let me start with Maoism Third Worldism to provide a very brief overview of it. And then we will go into talking about intersectional Marxism and how it can help us to expand upon Maoism Third Worldism and develop it into something even more helpful and more beneficial for humanity. Again, Maoism Third Worldism is, to my understanding, based on the assumption that the first world is not at present capable of establishing socialism or communism. By capable, I mean that we don't really have sufficient dialectical or revolutionary potential in the first world. And it seems to me that that should be obvious. It is not what most people think. I think, from my observations, it is not the common perception. I honestly don't understand it in some ways. In other ways, I do understand it because at one time I didn't understand it. So perhaps I should understand it more than I do. But I suppose since re-embracing Maoism Third Worldism, I've come to the conclusion that it literally makes no sense to think about communism in any other way. When I talk about thinking about communism, I mean thinking about establishing a communist world system. And again, I am modifying the term communist world system from Emanuel Wallerstein's term capitalist world system. And Wallerstein himself was a kind of third worldist. His views were based on what is called dependency theory. Uh, it is um, it is somewhat similar to Maoism Third Worldism, which also gets much of its inspiration from dependency theory. But Wallerstein took dependency theory in a considerably different direction. His focus was not so much on praxis or theoretically based practice, which is what I am interested in as a Maoist third worldist primarily, but his focus instead was on analysis. So he calls his perspective world systems analysis. Some people have referred to it as world systems theory, but Wallerstein objects to that. He says it's not really a theory, it's a method of analysis. And I think that I try to keep that in my head whenever I'm thinking about it, so I don't get what he is doing and what I have done in the past, and I'm still doing to a large extent, confused. Okay, basically, um, Maoism-Third Worldism begins with Maoism. Obviously, that's the first word, right, in Maoism-Third Worldism. Maoism was a tendency, a communist tendency, which was developed by Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, as he is sometimes called in English. Um, Mao was an interesting guy. He was influenced by Marxism-Leninism. You could argue that Maoism is a continuation or an elaboration upon Marxism-Leninism. Now, was Chairman Mao perfect? No, he certainly was not. He made his share of mistakes. He was a human being, like all of us. I mean, Karl Marx made his own mistakes as well. So whenever you're talking about human beings, to expect them to be free of all faults is really, really unrealistic. And Mao was not free of all faults. For example, um, his attempt to establish a kind of cultural revolution was really not a very good idea. That did not work out very well for Maoism. But I think if we can put that baggage off to the side and take the grain of truth, more than a grain, but let's say grain of truth in Mao's ideas, and then wed them with third worldism, we can come up with a really good theory, a really good tendency, or current, which is what Maoism third worldism is. So the Maoism is basically focused upon the idea of revolution, as communism generally is, in establishing socialism and communism through revolutionary activity, through praxis. Um, the idea is, in other words, that trying to establish communism through progress, as some people say, especially people who are social democrats and democratic socialists, is not a very realistic way of establishing socialism or communism. Why? Well, because communism is so far removed from the world that we live in at present that any kind of change from where we are now to where I hope we will be at some time in the future will take a lot of work. It's not something that can be done very simply, for example, through legislation, through democratic elections, through instituting various reform measures. Now, I am not saying that I'm opposed to that. Some reform measures can be beneficial. And I think that especially given the fact that here in the first world where I am, that we are not yet ready to have a communist revolution, that reform measures might be good. There's nothing wrong with helping people. I love the workers. I love the proletariat. I like to think I love everyone, but I'm not sure if that's realistic. But I certainly try to love as many people as I can. And I care for people. I genuinely do care for people. And if one cares for people, then one is going to try to look for ways to try to make their lives less free of troubles. And certainly in the capitalist world system, trouble is almost inevitable. Trouble is constant. What we see going on right now in Gaza, the horrendous war crimes being committed by the government of Israel under the direction of Benjamin, aka Bibi Netanyahu, is very discouraging. And it can make one lose faith in humanity. I know that from time to time I do. I become extremely pessimistic. I become extremely skeptical and even cynical. And I begin to feel sometimes that there's really no point. I mean, if the world is as messed up as it is, why is it messed up? Well, it's messed up because of us. We are the ones who made the world messed up. Um, the world is not inherently messed up. We made the world through our own agency. We made the world as it is. And only we, acting in unison, or at least acting with as many people as we can find, can change the world and make it a lot better. And so, if the first world is not yet ready for revolution, what about the third world? Well, the third world has actually seen its share of revolutions in the 21st century. For example, and this is not a Marxist illustration, but it certainly fits the bill. In Iraq, there was an actual communist society established there. The society was wonderfully inaugurated. Women and men worked together. Um, there was no competition between the genders. People actually cared for each other. And then what happened? Well, the government of President Erdogan in Turkey came in and bombed them to smithereens. The people who were left were forced to flee and go to other places. And as far as I know, and maybe I'm wrong, if so, you can correct me in the comments section below this video. As far as I know, that project is gone. There is no more communist society in Iraq. And I was really hoping that it would happen. But, hope against hope is the problem. Some people hope for some things, other people hope for other things. So the solution is not really hope. Not really. I mean, it's always good to hope, but the solution is always activism. What can we actually do to improve the world? Um, Marx said that we should always focus on current material conditions, because if we start speculating too much, now, nothing wrong with speculation a little, but if we focus our energies too much on speculation, then we may begin to drift away from our prime goal, which should be action. What can I personally do as an individual to promote the eventual establishment of socialism or communism? And that is a question that I imagine that each one of us will answer in a different way. I have answered that question partially through podcasting, partially through my work as a self-defined person in Antifa, which is not an organization. There is no Antifa club or movement that you can actually join. Nobody is a member of Antifa, contrary to what Donald Trump apparently believes. He also mispronounces Antifa as Antifa, which misleads people into what it is. What the heck is Antifa? What the heck is Antifa? Well, Antifa makes no sense. Antifa, on the other hand, if you continue it, it's anti-fascism. So then you can figure out, oh, this person is an anti-fascist. Okay, so that's an example of some of the praxis that I think even us living in the first world can engage in terms of trying to establish a communist society. But most of the work, regrettably, in my view, because I wish that I could do more than I can, will, I think, fall on the third world. And that is really a shame, because the first world has been putting its burdens on the third world for a really long time. Anything that it could not do, it turned over to the third world. When the first world was unhappy with something that was happening in the third world, the first world did whatever it could to end it. So in 1953, the United States, as it is now openly admitted, overthrew the government of President Mossadegh in Iran and put in Shah Pahlavi, who's basically an American puppet. And so when in 1979, during the Iranian Revolution, which I remember very well, the Iranians began shouting, "America is the great Satan." Many Americans had no idea what to make of that. What, why are we so bad? What did we do wrong? Well, our memory may not be that great, but the memory of Iranians was really, really good. And they knew what we had done to them in 1953. We tried multiple times to assassinate Fidel Castro. Fortunately, we failed every time. Stalin, after World War II, wanted to establish friendly diplomatic relations with the Western world. Who turned him down? The US and other countries, which eventually became a part of NATO. We turned Stalin down. We are the ones who caused the Cold War, not Stalin. It was us. And so that's what makes me pessimistic. Living in the center of the empire, the United States, the place where the empire started, the engine of the empire, the United States. We are the fuel for the empire. Without us, for example, it is doubtful whether NATO could exist. But despite all that, because of the fact that the third world is oppressed and dominated by the first world, I think it is much more likely that the third world has sufficient revolutionary potential to accomplish something that we have not been successful at all at doing. And we have tried a number of times, but we have not been successful at establishing socialism or communism, at least on a long-term basis. I mean, we've made tries at it in the former Soviet Union, in mainland China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, and so forth. But what has been the result of all of those efforts? Not much. We are back to living in a world which is dominated by the first world. And that by being dominated by the first world means primarily being dominated by the US. Being dominated by the US means being dominated by the capitalist world system. So that is why I sometimes lose hope. And I think that a lot of people who are communists lose hope as well for similar reasons. I mean, it's hard to be hopeful in a world that we're living in right now where Israelis are mercifully killing Palestinians, including babies, including fetuses, just slaughtering people shamelessly, seemingly lacking any semblance of what might be called a human conscience, behaving like absolute monsters. Well, they are absolute monsters because anybody that would do what the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are now doing is an absolute monster. So I think that is our hope. Our hope is with the third world. If there is a first world, and I say if, because I don't know, maybe there will be, maybe not, then perhaps the first world can join the third world and have our own revolutions. The third world is certainly not a single entity. there are many different countries with many different cultures in the third world. And so, as Stalin talked about socialism in one country, I don't think we should be afraid to resurrect that idea and to be willing to talk about socialism in many different countries and not to expect them all to fit into a neat, convenient pattern, meaning the socialism that exists in one third world country and the socialism that exists in another may be quite different. We don't know that. The time has not yet come. That will be something for people who live at that time, who are involved in revolutionary praxis, to work out for themselves. It is not my job as a retired college professor living in the first world to tell the third world what to do. I do not approve of any type of colonialism or any type of imperialism or any type of what the great Antonio Gramsci called cultural hegemony. I do not want to dictate to the third world how they should run their affairs. But I think that the third world will be left because the United States and its allies will simply not be around. The fact that we are around now is really a stranglehold on the third world. The US and other first world countries are not helping the third world at all. So I think that we need to put our hope, at least for now, in the third world. Okay, so that's a kind of very basic overview of Maoism-Third Worldism. Now let's get into this a little bit more in detail by bringing in the concept of intersectional Marxism. Now, intersectional Marxism should not be confused with generic intersectionality. Intersectionality as a model, not a theory, but as a model or a conceptual framework, was started by the law professor Kimberly Crenshaw. And perhaps the second most important proponent of it was Patricia Hill Collins, a professor emeritus from the University of Maryland in sociology. I once had the pleasure of serving on a panel with Patty. I actually sat to her right. We each presented our own papers, but our papers were on the same general theme. At that time, Patty was not very well known. Nobody had heard of intersectionality, except maybe for me. I heard of it because I was using one of the books written by Patricia Hill Crenshaw and Margaret L. Anderson, which was called Race, Class, and Gender, which was the first college textbook to introduce the concept of intersectionality. So let's talk about that, and then let's move from that over to intersectional Marxism, which is really more important to me anyway than a more generic intersectionality as developed by Crenshaw and Collins. One of the major concepts in intersectionality, according to Collins, is shifting the center of our thinking. To me, that is one of the most important elements of intersectionality, because I have to continually struggle to shift the center of my thinking from the first world, where I live, to the third world, where although I don't live, I am only 2 miles from. As I have said many times, Mexico is literally 2 miles to the south of me. right on this road in front of my condo complex. I make a left turn, head down 2 miles, and there's the bridge which crosses over into Mexico. So I'm really, really close, but I'm not there. And I know that the people there are in really bad shape, economically, politically, and in terms of their own security. The cartels basically dominate much of Mexico. They have destroyed the lives of many people. They blow up cars, they blow up homes, and they slaughter people. They are known to slowly decapitate people as well. They are not very nice people. They make their money through drug smuggling, primarily into the US. There are tunnels which go from Mexico right here. In fact, most likely right near where I live, for all I know. There might be a tunnel just a few blocks from here. I have no idea. But I'm in that area that people talk about. When people talk about tunnels from Mexico to the US, they're talking about my hometown right here in Mission, Texas, and Alton, Texas, and McAllen, Texas, and Palmview, Texas, and Palmhurst, Texas. That's where I am. I am in Mission. And Mission has a very low crime rate, contrary to what a lot of people believe. There is very little violence or property crime here. Some of the cartel members live here in the Rio Grande Valley, but they don't cause any trouble here. They're here. Many of them own large mansions in the area, especially in Alton, which is right next to Mission. But it's hard for anything to be done about them. You would have to resort to a kind of stop and frisk approach, basically stopping everyone and doing an investigation as to why they are here, asking for documentation from everyone. How do you do that? It's very difficult, and it might break the law as well. But those cartel members are right here in Hidalgo County, where I live, the warmest county in the state of Texas. Where I am is literally on the same latitude as Miami, Florida. What the cartel members here in Hidalgo County do is they receive the drugs coming through the tunnels from Mexico, and then they distribute those drugs to the rest of the United States. That is how much of the drug trade from Mexico to the United States works in a nutshell. So I think shifting the center, focusing on the third world, not focusing on the first world, is really, really important. And it is an extraordinarily significant part of the intersectionality developed by Patricia Hill Collins. That was perhaps her most important and most relevant contribution to intersectionality. Now let's get into some other things. Intersectionality can be thought of like a map. In fact, a map is the metaphor that Kimberly Crenshaw uses in one of her video presentations for intersectionality. Now, is there just one map? No, there are many maps. How many? I don't know. But my map, for example, and the map of an African American man, the map of an African American woman, the map of a white woman, the map of a physically disabled person, whatever race or gender. Those maps are going to be different. Now, what is a map. What is intersectionality, in other words? If you can picture a road map, and you think of the road map as having all these roads, or as I prefer, thoroughfares on them, because I like the word fares in them. Fares, money, reminds me of capitalism. So for me, it's kind of a play on words, I guess. But if you look at a map and you see all these highways, these avenues, these streets, these thoroughfares, whatever you want to call them, they intersect. That's intersectionality. Now, how they intersect will be different with different people. So the way in which race and gender intersect for me as a white man will be different from how they intersect for somebody else, say a black woman. And their status is going to be different than mine because the place along the thoroughfare of race, say, and their place along the thoroughfare of gender, say, is not going to be the same. So that is the real beauty, as I see it, of intersectionality. It allows us to conceive of race, gender, sex, cultural hegemony, disability, and so forth as different thoroughfares on the map. But their points of intersection will differ depending upon the individual and depending upon what particular status or statuses a particular individual operates in. And so that's a very simple, I think, description of intersectionality. Now, let's take that a step further. I mentioned that intersectionality can be conceived of as a map. Intersectionality can also be conceived of as class. Class is a basic part of Marxism. Arguably, class is the most important feature or concept in Marxism. It is the class system which has created the kind of inequality, the kind of intersectionality, the map or maps that we see in the world today. So this map, in addition to being a map of intersectionality, is also a map of class. So we can say that intersectionality and class are essentially synonymous. In other words, intersectionality is a way of understanding what class is in a very analytical form and how class operates. So to me, intersectionality is highly sophisticated. For instance, let's apply Maoism-Third Worldism to intersectionality or intersectional Marxism. Say we take the first world as a thoroughfare or a road, and the third world as another thoroughfare and road. Well, obviously those two thoroughfares are different. One is an oppressor and one is oppressed. And they intersect with each other at different points. So, for instance, Haiti is third world. India is third world. Pakistan is third world. Jamaica is third world. but they are all very different from one another. And so you really can't draw exactly the same map of intersectionality or social class for every imaginable configuration of intersections. And that applies as much to the first world and the third world as it does to race, class, gender, and so forth. All of those are structures. In other words, they are sets of rules and guidelines which tell us how we are expected to behave in various social situations. And often, what are the consequences to us if we misbehave? Sometimes there are severe consequences, sometimes there are minimal consequences, and sometimes there are no consequences at all. Let me give you an example of the latter. Where I live, the previous board of directors in my condo complex has allegedly committed various crimes, stealing money from the homeowners association fund and using that money to furnish their homes. That's pretty atrocious. We have some people, I don't know how many, but some, who live in my community who are relatively poor. They survive mostly on Social Security and Medicare. For them, having that money stolen from the HOA fund is very catastrophic. For me, not really. As a multimillionaire, as a member of the nouveau riche, the new money, I would barely notice it, if at all. And yet, if I shift the center, in this case, to the fourth world, meaning people who are Americans, but who are in poverty, that's an example of the fourth world. Fourth world would also include many indigenous populations and many disabled populations, and perhaps others, people who are not living at the same standard of living, say, that I am, and people who most likely will never live at my standard of living, which I find very, very depressing. That's part of the reason for my almost constant pessimism, to be honest. These people have been totally screwed over, allegedly. I always need to add allegedly, by the board of directors, by the HOA, the Home Owners Association. Now, what's going to happen to them? I just had a conversation with somebody, another resident of this area, who says that what he thinks will happen to them is nothing. That basically all the courts, the prosecutors want to happen is for those people to pick up and leave. What kind of justice is that? It's not justice at all. So when I shift the center from my own position in the nouveau riche to these people living right here in my condo complex, who are living in poverty, who struggle to make it from one month to the next, living here in Hidalgo County, one of the least expensive counties to live in in the entire country of the United States. That's where I am. And despite that, these people are in desperate shape, truly desperate shape. Can I do anything? Not really. I can give to charities. I can financially help out people, which I do as much as I can. But in terms of actually resolving the situation, I'm not a prosecutor. I'm not a judge. I'm not a police officer. I can't arrest them. I can't accuse them of committing any crimes officially. I can't try them in a court because I have no court. So literally, I am, in spite of my wealth, very weak. Very weak. I literally have no power at all. So what's the point of having the money? To me, none. And that is what I have concluded. That having money is only worthwhile if you can shift the center to those who are oppressed in this map of intersectionality or class, and actually help those people who are unfortunates. But if I can't help them, then my wealth is essentially worthless. And it is worthless to me. I mean, what do I care? I'm almost 68 years old. How many more years do I have left on this planet? Not many. I mean, I don't know, obviously, exactly, but I can't imagine it's more than 20 or so. Even that's a stretch, perhaps. I mean, my father died when he was 89, so maybe 21 years. I don't know. My mother died when she was 79, so maybe 11 years. I don't know again. But again, there's nothing really I can do. And so I think that that is what we're left with. When we look at intersectionality, when we look at this map of social class or intersectionality, is that we are all in a relative position of weakness as individuals. Nobody as an individual can do that much. If we don't act together in unison as a human family, sorry for the trite reference, then what purpose do we have for being here? Nothing that I can personally think of. So, in any event, that is how I would connect Maoism-Third Worldism with intersectionality. First, by understanding what Maoism-Third Worldism is. Second, through intersectionality, by shifting the center of my thinking from the first world to the third world, and then finally, understanding that this map of intersectionality, this map of intersecting thoroughfares, is really a map of social class. And in order to accomplish anything, we need to understand the social class system and struggle with every ounce of our being. And I mean that. I mean that, even though I don't know how to do that, to eliminate it. Because social class, social classes simply should not exist. they are unjust, and they are inhuman. This has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.